Oh, thank you so much. Great to be here. Thank you to Luke and the organisers for inviting Equity to come along and to be part of your event today. As has already been said, I'm the Equalities and Diversity Organiser for Equity, and it is a new role. There have been colleagues doing lots of work within Equity on equality and diversity previously, but it's the first time that the union has dedicated a post specifically full-time to this area. And essentially my role is threefold. Firstly, to advise any member or any member of staff on any equality and diversity issue. Secondly, we have 4 equality committees around gender, ethnicity, disability and sexual orientation, and it's my role to be the secretary to those committees and to execute their agenda and support and advise. And then thirdly, to lead on any equality-related initiatives or campaigns. As has already been said, I've been in the role for 6 months, so what have I been doing in all that time? Well, hopefully I'll come on to point to some of that work. But I'm really delighted to see that equality in the arts is first on the agenda for your event today, because I think it's really one of the biggest issues facing the arts at the moment. And as Luke said, what I think is really interesting is that it is seen as more a mainstream, in inverted commas, debate and issue confronting the industry. I'm used to people like me, equalities officers, talking about these issues and no one else in that particular sector. And I think it's really heartening, at least, that more and more people are taking responsibility for dealing with this issue. And I mean, Luke mentioned the response that he had from somebody in relation to this event about how it's been talked about since '98. Well, I'm sure there's people in the room who've been talking about it for way before then, and I'll touch again on that. But I think it is great that we do continue to talk about it. Not enough has changed, but all the more reason that we need to keep focused on these issues and make sure that they are in the forefront of people's minds and that we do move forward and see that progress. These are issues that they do unfortunately take a lot of time to see that sustainable change, but all the more reason to keep with that. I thought I'd use my time just to focus a little on the state of the problem and some of the things that we're doing within Equity to contribute to that progress that we all want to see. So how bad are things? Well, I think that's part and parcel of the problem, that we just actually don't know. There's not enough information out there. There's not enough comprehensive data that's systematically collected to tell us what our stages look like and in terms of Equity's other work, certainly what our screens and airwaves sound like. But I'll come back to that. There is some research that's out there. It's fairly thin on the ground, but people occasionally do partial snapshots on what they see on stage. And so from what is out there, we do know that 1 in 3 people that you'll see on stage will be female. That Asian and Southeast Asian people in particular are underrepresented amongst Black and minority ethnic people that we do see on stage, and we know that even that, of course, is unrepresented. I can't be more specific necessarily because we don't have enough data. A piece of work that Act for Change did, who are campaigning for diversity on screen and stage, found that when they tracked the diversity of what was on stage over Easter weekend this year, they picked a handful of theatres in London and across the country. They found that 1 out of 326 actors was a visibly disabled actor. And Drama UK, in some research that they did, found that life after 44 on stage was limited. So, you know, there are a range of issues, and that when we talk about equality and diversity, and we've talked about race, we've talked about disability, you know, these issues are broad and across the spectrum. So we know that equality legislation, for example, in the UK covers 9 distinct areas, and my work and the work that Equity is looking at is certainly looking across the board, and including actually one of those areas that's not covered by the legislation, unfortunately, which is around socioeconomic group and class, which I'm sure we'd all agree is a massive barrier to this industry. So all those statistics that I presented, we all know that those are deeply unreflective of the workforces out there, here in this area, but also across the country, and indeed of our society as well. And at Equity, we are frustrated and impatient about that lack of progress. And, you know, we've talked about how long these issues have been talked about. And I found that one of our trustees handed me a copy of an Equity journal. It's called the Equity magazine now, but it was then called the Equity Journal, which was published in 1983. And it was about a conference that was held on what we used to describe as integrated casting. And apparently in there it said that we first started talking about integrated casting in 1967. So certainly in equity, these issues have been talked about for the best part of 50 years. And this special edition of the Equity Journal was reporting on this conference, on this topic, and it had a list of recommendations. When I read those recommendations, we're still talking essentially about the same things, and our policy has been talking about these issues for a very long time. So it just speaks to the fact that these are not new issues. But I think while we have seen change, we need to see far more. So what is Equity actually doing in this area? Well, in June, Equity agreed new policy in this area. You'll find it on our website. It's an inclusive casting policy statement, and it was led by our Minority Ethnic Members Committee. They looked at our existing policy and said, we really need to update this. It needs to reflect our modern day situation. In fact, we had separate policy statements on ethnicity and disability in relation to inclusive casting, and they couldn't see the sense of that, wanted to see one modern, updated statement that reflected equality and diversity across the board. And indeed, the Equality Committees worked together to update that policy. And now, as I say, we talk in terms of inclusive casting, again, which just reflects the age of our policy statement previously. And that new policy has three central asks. Firstly, it's calling for more incidental portrayal. And when I say that, what I mean is that we want to see more actors from a whole range of backgrounds, and when they're on stage or on screen, they are not there because of who they are, that who they are is incidental to their characterization, and we think that that's one of the few ways we're really going to see an increase in volume of people who are invisible at the moment. Secondly, we recognise that sometimes diversity is relevant to a particular role, and in those instances, we'd like to see more care and attention taken by creative leaders and casting directors to who they cast. And our Deaf and Disabled Members Committee, we have the Vice Chair here, Phoebe Kemp, who is actually responsible for what I call the triple lock in our second call when we're asking for more care and attention, because it's particularly relevant to the casting of disabled actors. And the committee in particular, reflecting and representing the views of our disabled members, are concerned about the trend that we've seen over a long period of time, where increasingly where there are disabled roles, it's non-disabled actors who are often cast in those roles. So what we're calling for is, firstly, within this, as I describe it, triple lock, is actively seeking a disabled actor, an actor who matches that impairment where disability, for example, might be relevant to the role. We recognise that may not always be possible, so if that's not possible, then secondly, to have a disabled actor who maybe doesn't reflect that impairment but has the lived experience of being a disabled person to enhance the portrayal they bring to that role. And then thirdly, if that's not possible, then to ensure that that production is consulting in some way with an organisation or an individual who lives with that impairment, who again can bring a real authenticity to the portrayal of that role. So that's the second area of the policy. And then the third one is just calling for all players in the industry, all venues, all employers, to improve their equality practice across the board, whether that's in relation to their audiences, whether that's in relation into their employment, or whether that's in relation to their casting, which of course the rest of the policy statement talks about. So that's the breadth of the policy. And indeed, really, when we looked at the previous policy statements, essentially, as I've been saying, the core of that really is no different to when it was first talked about in the late 60s. Luke mentioned briefly the statement that Equity made about the Rose Theatre, about the casting of Trevor Nunn's productions of The Wars of the Roses. So I'll touch on that briefly. That was very much in response to the views of our members who had contacted us when they had learnt about this, and as a union, it's the work of the members who lead our work, and it's the voice of the members that we seek to represent. And when members were contacting us in quite some numbers about this, we felt that it was an opportune moment to reflect the new policy and to respond to their views. And I think what I would say about that is just that we were very much talking from an industrial position and not an artistic one. So we understand that as a union, our responsibility is about the industrial interests of our members, their terms and conditions, making sure that those are the best as they can possibly be for all those working in the industry. And we're very clear that when casting doesn't reflect the diversity of our members, that disproportionately affects some of our members from certain groups that affects their work opportunities. So what we are saying is that inclusive casting is not coming from an artistic position, we are coming from an industrial position. This is the equality and diversity implications from an industrial point of view. So I would just make that point about the Rose Statement, and happy to talk further either during the panel discussion or afterwards about that. In relation to the policy, the equality committees were really clear. They didn't want this policy statement to just sit on a shelf. They wanted us to be active about it, and I suppose the Rose Statement is an example of that. But we are also still working on an active campaign just so that we can ensure that ultimately these issues are at the forefront of people's minds, and that they're not an afterthought, and they're not things that are not thought about until it's too late. And we're still exploring about what that could look like, but ultimately we believe it's not enough for the industry really to keep talking about this issue. They have to recognise that collectively we need to make different decisions if we're going to see a difference in what we see. So really just pushing the industry to do something different. And we're going to be working with Act for Change, who I mentioned earlier. They've expressed an interest in working with us to highlight the policy statement. Obviously, as a union, we can't impose that on anyone, but simply to demonstrate an expression, an aspiration of what our members think should be possible, and to talk to employers about that and see if they share those aspirations. And we're keen to recognise good practice as well as the reverse. And indeed, we're very conscious that practice sometimes isn't necessarily improved when you clobber people over the head. We're really very conscious of that, and we want to highlight those really good examples and celebrate what is possible and not just the reverse. So we will be working on that over the coming months, and hopefully you'll see the benefit of that. But how do we really track progress, which really brings us back to the problem of data? Without a comprehensive picture of what the situation really looks like, it's really difficult to be able to get a sense of whether things are changing or not, and are things going in the right direction or not. And that's why last year, Equity campaigned really hard, led again by our equality committees, to push the Arts Council and indeed the broadcasters to start collecting this data more systematically, so that we don't have to rely too much on partial snapshots of data, which can sometimes be misleading. You might be able to pick all kinds of holes in the statistics that I mentioned earlier, and you'd be right to, because they are only partial. So we're really keen to be able to ensure that the industry is building up a bank of information that can demonstrate what's really happening and what's happening over time. And we're glad that the Arts Council have amended their annual survey. So from the end of this financial year, the national portfolio organisations will be replying and responding not just on the diversity of their permanent and temporary staff, but we'll be able to tell from those returns what the diversity of actors on stage also looks like, which is great. And we also know that the broadcasters are working together on what they can do in this area. And so as a result, we're about to start a campaign with our members to really encourage them to support these initiatives, so that when they're in a production for a national portfolio organisation and they're handed an anonymous equality monitoring form, they have the confidence and the reassurance to complete that form and to make sure that that data is really fed into that bigger picture, which is so important. So we'll be really encouraging our members to support those initiatives, and we'll be continuing to press the Arts Council and the broadcasters to collect and to publish that data, because only then will we really be able to see if there's truly a positive change taking place. Lastly, I wanted to highlight another campaign that Equity is supporting but didn't start itself, which is called Parents in Performing Arts. Started by Equity members, launched a couple of weeks ago to a packed-out Young Vic, and is really highlighting the difficulties for parents working in the industry, given what we know about the difficulties in childcare provision generally, whatever sector you work in, but obviously in our industry, given the hours, the long hours and the nature of the work really exacerbates the situation. One of the campaigners did a survey quite off her own back, and she surveyed up to 500 people, asking parents about what their experiences were. And she found that 74% of the people that she surveyed had had to turn down work because of the restrictions of the childcare available. And it's really affecting not just existing parents, but those who might want to start a family and are starting to do that later and later because of their concerns about their ability to stay in the industry industry, and we think these are real issues of great concern. As I say, the campaign was launched 2 weeks ago, and the stage has certainly covered some of the support that some of our creative leaders have put behind the campaign, which is great. And they're very effectively already raising the issues that need to change, and we will continue to support them in that campaign. And I guess in closing, I'd just like to thank the organisers again for putting this issue on the agenda and giving us the opportunity to come and talk to you about some of the work that we're doing, and looking forward to kind of working with you in relation to that work, and look forward to talking further with you about equality in the arts. Thank you so much.